Roy blinked. "Bill, you've been to dozens of barbecues in this neighborhood. Heck, you were here for Tyler's graduation party last month when the Johnsons had their fire pit going, too." Bill's jaw tightened. "I'm aware, Roy, but those were different circumstances. We're in a drought watch now, and the rules have changed. I'm sorry, but the department has to respond to every complaint by the book." The two officers stood silently, but their presence added weight to Bill's words. Roy clenched his fist, fighting the urge to shout. "So, who complained? Was it one of the new neighbors, or—" Bill sighed, stepping aside to gesture back at the waiting SUV. "We received an anonymous tip, and when officers drove by, they saw open flames. You and I both know I have to file a report, Roy." Roy turned to glance back at the quiet street, his mind racing. The sense of security he'd built here was suddenly under threat, and worse, it felt like it was coming from someone close. He tried to catch Linda's eye through the living room window, but she was still absorbed in her phone, her expression impossible to read. "What happens now?" Roy finally asked, voice hoarse. "The officers will write up a warning citation," Bill said, attempting a softer tone. "Cooperate, take care of any fines. Just lay low for a few weeks, Roy." Roy forced a nod, his pride stinging. "Sure, Bill, whatever needs to be done." As Bill and the officers left, Roy stood in the doorway for a long moment, heart hammering in his chest. He felt Tyler's hand on his shoulder from behind. "Dad, is everything okay?" Tyler asked quietly. "Yeah," Roy lied, summoning a faint smile. "Just a misunderstanding, son. Nothing to worry about." Tyler hesitated but seemed satisfied, heading back inside. Roy took a shaky breath, staring across the street at the SUV as it idled one last moment, then drove off into the dark. Something had shifted tonight in Pine Ridge. Roy could feel it in his bones. And as the embers of the fire pit cooled, a chill crept into the summer air, settling deep in his heart. "This is different." Bill stepped aside, revealing the officers more clearly. "Officer Martinez, Officer Kim, this is Roy Brennan, Tyler's father." Roy's blood chilled. "What does Tyler have to do with this?" "Tyler Brennan, you're under arrest for arson in the 4th degree," Officer Martinez announced, stepping forward with handcuffs. "What?" Tyler appeared in the hallway behind Roy, Amy at his side. "Grandpa Bill, what's going on?" "You started an illegal fire that could have endangered the neighborhood," Bill said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in the fire service. "Time you learned about consequences, boy." Roy stepped protectively in front of his son. "This is insane, Bill. It was a backyard bonfire with proper safety measures." "The fire exceeded safe parameters," Bill continued, pulling out his phone to show photos. "I documented it myself. That fire was easily 6 feet high at its peak." Roy stared at the photos, which clearly showed flames much larger than what they'd actually had. The angles were deceptive, making their modest fire appear dangerously large. "Those photos are evidence. They'll cut him off. Tyler needs to understand that actions have consequences. A night in jail and some community service will teach him responsibility." "Dad," Tyler's voice cracked. At 18, he was still more boy than man when frightened. Roy felt Linda's presence before he saw her. She appeared in the living room doorway, but instead of supporting her husband and son, she stood silent, arms crossed. "Linda," Roy called to her, "tell them how careful we were tonight." Linda looked at her father, then at Roy. Maybe Dad's right. Tyler does need to learn about responsibility." The words hit Roy like a physical blow. His own wife was siding against their son. Against him. "Mom?" Tyler's voice was disbelieving. "It's just one night, honey," Linda said softly. "Your grandfather knows what he's doing." Roy watched in numb shock as his son was handcuffed and led to a patrol car. Neighbors had gathered on their porches, phones out, recording the spectacle. The Brennan family name, built through years of honest work and community involvement, was being destroyed in real time. As the patrol car drove away with Tyler, Bill turned back to Roy. Sometimes tough love is the only love that works. Linda understands that. Roy noticed how Bill's hand briefly touched Linda's shoulder, how she leaned into the contact. Something cold and calculating settled into Roy's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his boxing days, when an opponent had sucker punched him. "I'll post bail first thing in the morning," Roy said quietly. "Bail's been set at $5,000, Bill replied. "Cash only. Seems the judge thinks flight risk is a concern for college-bound kids." $5,000 cash. Roy's construction account had barely $3,000, and his business account was tied up in a current project. Bill would know this. Linda handled their household finances and shared everything with her family. Roy closed the front door with trembling hands, trying to steady his breath as Linda drifted back toward her phone, her face a mask he could no longer read. Tonight, his family felt smaller and infinitely more fragile than it ever had before. After Bill left, Roy found Linda in the kitchen making tea, as if their son hadn't just been arrested on fabricated charges. "How could you?" Roy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad knows what he's doing," Linda replied without turning around. "Tyler's been getting too big for his britches lately. Maybe this will humble him." Roy stepped closer. "He's an honors student who's never been in trouble. He just got accepted to college, Linda. This arrest could jeopardize his scholarship." "You baby him too much." Linda finally faced him, and Roy saw something in her eyes he'd never noticed before. Contempt. "You baby all of us. Sometimes people need to face consequences." Roy stared at his wife of 20 years. He really looked at her. The new clothes, the expensive haircut, the phone she guarded like a state secret, the late nights visiting family, and the sudden interest in yoga classes that seemed to require overnight trips to Denver. "What's his name?" Roy asked quietly. Linda's teacup rattled against the saucer. "What?" "The man you're seeing. What's his name?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Linda's face cycled through denial, anger, and finally a cold satisfaction. "His name is Trevor Ashford," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "He's an architect, successful, refined, educated, everything you're not." Roy nodded slowly, filing away the name. "How long?" 8 months. Linda's voice grew stronger, more confident. "I'm filing for divorce on Monday. Trevor and I are moving to Denver." "And Tyler?" "Tyler will be fine once he learns some discipline. Dad's going to help him understand what real men are like." Roy felt something fundamental shift inside him. The man who'd built his life on loyalty and family honor was dying, and something harder, colder, was taking his place. "I see." Roy's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Well, I better go figure out how to get our son out of jail." Linda shrugged. Good luck with that. As Roy walked upstairs to his office, he was already planning. He'd get Tyler out, of course. But Bill Hendress, Linda, and Trevor Ashford had just made the worst mistake of their lives. They had assumed Roy Brennan was the kind of man who would take this lying down. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Roy spent the night in his office, not sleeping, but planning. By dawn, he'd made a dozen phone calls and liquidated his emergency fund, scraping together the $5,000 for Tyler's bail. But as he drove to the county jail, his mind wasn't on the money. It was on the intelligence he'd gathered during those sleepless hours. Trevor Ashford, it turned out, was indeed an architect. He was also married to a woman named Patricia Ashford, had 2 young daughters, and lived in a prestigious Denver suburb. Roy gripped the steering wheel tighter as he considered all that he had learned, determination burning in his veins. More importantly, he was the lead architect on the new Pine Ridge Community Center, a project Roy's construction company had bid on, only to lose out to a firm with suspiciously low estimates. Roy collected Tyler at 8 a.m., finding his son hollow-eyed and shaken. The night in county lockup had changed something in the boy's face, hardening him in a way that reminded Roy of his own younger self. "Dad, I don't understand why Mom," Tyler began as they walked to Roy's truck. "Your mother's made her choices," Roy said quietly. "Now we make ours." They drove home in silence, but as they pulled into the driveway, Roy noticed Linda's car was gone. Inside, he found a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to Denver for a few days. Tyler's court date is Thursday. Linda." Tyler crumpled the note, his jaw working with suppressed emotion. "She didn't even wait to see if I was okay." "She showed us who she really is," Roy said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's actually a gift, Tyler. Most people hide their true nature better." Roy's phone buzzed with a text from his foreman. "Mike Ashford's on site at the Riverside project. Says he needs to inspect our foundation work." Interesting. Roy had built foundations for 30 years without ever needing an architect's inspection mid-pour. He texted back, "On my way." The Riverside project was Roy's largest current contract. A custom home for the Riverside family worth $400,000 to his company. As Roy and Tyler drove to the site, Roy explained what they were walking into. "Trevor Ashford is your mother's boyfriend," Roy said bluntly. "He's also the architect who's been causing problems with our permits lately." Tyler's hands clenched into fists. "He's been sabotaging our business." "Appears so, and I suspect last night's arrest was about more than teaching you lessons." At the construction site, they found Trevor Ashford standing over freshly poured concrete, shaking his head at Roy's crew. He was everything Linda had described. Tall, lean, expensively dressed, with the kind of soft hands that had never done real work. "Roy," Trevor called out with false friendliness. "Glad you're here. I'm afraid we have a problem." Roy walked over, noting how his crew, men who'd worked with him for years, watched nervously. "What kind of problem, Trevor?" "This foundation is 4 inches off specification." Trevor pointed to his tablet, showing architectural drawings. "The entire thing will need to be torn out and repoured." Roy studied the tablet, then looked at the concrete. "According to whose measurements?" "Mine. I'm the architect of record." "Actually," Roy said, pulling out his own tablet, "you're not the architect of record. It's Jennifer Walsh from Walsh and Associates. You're the architect for the community center project." Trevor's confident smile faltered slightly. "I'm consulting on this project." "Since when?" Roy opened his email, showing Trevor the project correspondence. "I've got every email on this build, and your name doesn't appear anywhere until yesterday." Nevertheless, Trevor straightened his tie. "The foundation is wrong. It needs to be redone." Roy nodded to his foreman. "Mike, get Jennifer Walsh on the phone." As Mike made the call, Roy studied Trevor more carefully. The man was nervous, sweating despite the cool morning air. This wasn't about construction standards. This was about money. "Jennifer says the foundation is perfect," Mike called out after a brief conversation. "She's looking at the photos I sent and everything matches her specifications exactly." Trevor's face flushed. "I'm ordering a stop work order until this is resolved." "You don't have that authority," Roy said calmly. "But feel free to call the building department. I'll wait." What followed was 20 minutes of phone calls that slowly demolished Trevor's credibility. The building department confirmed Roy's foundation met all specifications. Jennifer Walsh threatened to file complaints against Trevor for interfering with her project. Most damaging of all, Roy discovered that Trevor had been deliberately delaying permit approvals for Roy's projects while fast-tracking approvals for the contractor who'd underbid the community center. "Seems like someone's been playing games with the bidding process," Roy said as Trevor prepared to leave. "I wonder what the state licensing board would think about an architect manipulating permits for personal gain." Trevor turned back, his face pale. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" Roy held up his phone. "I've been recording this entire conversation. Amazing what patterns you can find when you start looking at permit approval times." As Trevor drove away, Tyler turned to his father with newfound respect. "You knew he'd try something like this." "I suspected." Roy watched Trevor's BMW disappear down the mountain road. "Your mother's boyfriend is greedy and foolish. Dangerous combination." That evening, Roy began making calls to contacts throughout the construction industry. By the time Linda returned from Denver 3 days later, Roy had built a comprehensive picture of Trevor's activities. The man had been taking kickbacks from contractors, manipulating permit approvals, and using his position to benefit friends and lovers at the expense of honest businesses. But Roy wasn't planning to turn this information over to authorities. That would be too easy, too clean. Trevor and Linda had destroyed his family, humiliated his son, and tried to ruin his business. They deserved something more personal. Linda arrived home on Tuesday evening, glowing with the confidence of a woman who believed she held all the cards. She found Roy in the kitchen, cooking dinner for Tyler, acting as if nothing had changed. "We need to talk," Linda announced. "Do we?" Roy continued stirring the pasta sauce. "Tyler, go finish your homework." Once they were alone, Linda pulled out a manila folder. "Divorce papers. I'm being generous. I'm only asking for half of everything." Roy glanced at the papers without touching them. He looked at Linda with a calm, steely resolve that unnerved her in a way nothing else ever had. "Half of everything, including the business I built before I met you. Community property laws are clear," Linda said smugly. "I've contributed to this family for 20 years, by sleeping with Trevor Ashford for 8 months. Linda's cheeks flushed, but she didn't deny it. "I'm not asking for alimony. That's generous, considering what I could claim. And Tyler, joint custody. Though Trevor thinks Tyler would benefit from spending more time with real role models. Role models like your father, the man who had our son arrested on false charges. Dad was trying to help Tyler grow up," Linda added, her voice dripping with false sincerity. Roy nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. He placed it on the counter between them. Linda's face went white. The photo showed her and Trevor entering a motel room, but it wasn't what she expected. In the background, clearly visible through the motel office window, was Patricia Ashford, Trevor's wife, apparently waiting to confront them. "Where did you get this?" Linda's voice was barely a whisper. "I hired a private investigator 3 months ago," Roy lied smoothly. He'd actually taken the photo himself yesterday after following Trevor to what he'd assumed was a romantic rendezvous. Finding Patricia Ashford there had been an unexpected bonus. Amazing what people will tell a devastated wife about her husband's activities. Linda sank into a chair. Patricia knows. Patricia knows everything about the affair, about the kickbacks, about the permit manipulation. She's filing for divorce and taking the kids. She's also agreed to testify about Trevor's business practices if needed. Roy reached for another folder, this one thick with documentation. Trevor's been busy falsifying permit applications, taking bribes, steering contracts to friends. The state licensing board received an anonymous tip yesterday along with copies of his financial records. "How did you get his financial records?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. Roy smiled coldly. "Trevor made a mistake when he tried to sabotage my foundation yesterday. He used his personal tablet for work, and when he connected to our construction site Wi-Fi to upload photos, our security system captured more than he intended." This was also a lie. Roy had actually gotten the financial information from Patricia Ashford, who'd been gathering evidence for her own divorce. But Linda didn't need to know that. "You're bluffing," Linda said, but her voice lacked conviction. Roy opened the folder and spread out bank statements, permit applications, and email printouts. Trevor's been taking $5,000 payments from Clearwater Construction in exchange for expedited permits. He's been delaying permits for companies that won't pay, and he's been using inside information from the permit process to help his girlfriend's husband lose bids. Linda stared at the evidence, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally terror. "This will destroy him." "Yes, it will." Roy's voice was calm. "And so will this." Roy pulled out another photo, this one showing Trevor and a known criminal, Victor Martinez, shaking hands in a dimly lit parking lot. Victor Martinez is a known associate of the Santos crime family. He's been under investigation for money laundering and racketeering. Seems Trevor has been playing with some dangerous friends. Linda's eyes widened in shock. "You can't prove that." "I don't need to," Roy said, his voice cold. "All I need to do is show this to the right people. The state licensing board, the police, the media. Trevor's career will be over before he can say inappropriate relationship." Linda's face crumpled, and for a moment Roy almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the look on Tyler's face when the police had taken him away, the cold satisfaction in Linda's eyes when she'd sided with her father against her own son, and he felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve. "You made your choices, Linda," Roy said quietly. "Now you have to live with them. And so does Trevor. And so does your father." With that, Roy gathered up the photos and documents, leaving Linda alone in the kitchen, her world crumbling around her. As he walked away, he knew that this was just the beginning. Trevor and Linda had started this war, but Roy was going to finish it. And he was going to make sure that they paid for every single thing they'd done to his family. As a matter of fact, Trevor Ashford will lose his license, his business, his family, and quite possibly face criminal charges. His life as he knows it is over. "You can't do this to him," Linda whispered desperately. "I'm not doing anything to him," Roy replied. "He did this to himself. I'm just making sure the right people know about it." Linda lunged for the papers, but Roy was faster, gathering them up and stepping back. "These are copies, Linda. The originals are already with the licensing board, the FBI's white-collar crime division, and Trevor's wife's divorce attorney." "The FBI?" Linda's voice was faint. "Permit fraud involving federal contractors is a federal crime. Trevor worked on the new post office last year, remember?" Roy watched his wife of 20 years crumble before his eyes. The confident woman who had walked in an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the consequences of her choices. "What do you want?" Linda whispered. "I want my son to have his charges dropped. I want a formal apology from your father, and I want you gone by Friday." "And if I agree?" Roy pretended to consider this. "Then I might be persuaded to let Trevor know about the investigation before the FBI shows up at his office. give him a chance to mitigate the damage. Linda nodded frantically. Yes, okay, I'll talk to Dad. I'll get the charges dropped. Good. Roy started toward the stairs, then paused. Oh, and Linda, if you ever try to contact Tyler again, if you ever come back to Pine Ridge, if you ever threaten my family in any way, I'll make sure Trevor spends the next decade in federal prison. Are we clear? Linda could only nod. As Roy climbed the stairs, he allowed himself a small smile. Act 1 was complete. Trevor and Linda thought they were dealing with a simple construction worker they could manipulate and discard. They were about to learn that Roy Brennan was much more than that. They had destroyed his family and humiliated his son. Now it was his turn. Thursday morning brought news that Tyler's charges had been mysteriously dropped. Fire Chief Bill Hendress personally called to inform them that, upon further review, the evidence was insufficient to proceed. He offered no apology, just a curt acknowledgement that the matter was closed. Roy accepted the news with apparent relief, playing the role of grateful father-in-law. But as he hung up the phone, Tyler caught the cold satisfaction in his father's eyes. You did more than just expose Trevor's business crimes, didn't you? Tyler asked. I did what was necessary. Roy poured himself coffee, noting how his son had changed since the arrest. The boy who'd gone to jail had been naive, trusting. The young man who'd returned was a harder warrior. Your grandfather and your mother thought they could push us around because they saw us as weak. It's important they understand their mistake. Linda had left the house before dawn, taking only a suitcase and leaving behind 20 years of accumulated possessions. Roy watched as a new chapter began, for him, for Tyler, and for the Brennan name. She'd also left a note agreeing to Roy's divorce terms and relinquishing any claim to Tyler's custody. The victory felt hollow. Roy had never wanted his marriage to end this way, but sometimes survival required cutting off gangrenous limbs. Tyler was scheduled to start college in 6 weeks, but the arrest had shaken his confidence. Roy could see his son questioning everything, wondering who else might betray him. We need to finish this, Roy said quietly. Not just for us, but for you. You need to know that actions have consequences for everyone, not just the powerless. That afternoon, Roy drove to the Pine Ridge Fire Department. He'd called ahead, requesting a meeting with Chief Hendress about community fire safety initiatives. It was the kind of meeting Bill couldn't refuse without seeming petty. Roy found Bill in his office, a shrine to 30 years of fire service. Awards covered the walls, commendations filled display cases, and photos showed Bill with various politicians and community leaders. It was the office of a man who'd built his identity around respect and authority. Roy? Bill stood, but didn't offer his hand. I thought we'd settled everything with Tyler's situation. We have, Roy said, taking a seat without being invited. I wanted to discuss something else, your retirement plans. Bill's eyes narrowed. My retirement is none of your business. Actually, it is. Roy pulled out a tablet and opened a video file. See, Bill, when you had my son arrested, you made a mistake. You used your official position to pursue a personal vendetta. That's abuse of power. That's ridiculous, Bill said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Is it? Roy turned the tablet toward him. The video showed Bill taking photos of the bonfire from across the street, but the timestamp revealed he'd arrived 20 minutes before Tyler even lit the fire. You planned the whole thing, Bill. You came prepared to document a crime that hadn't happened yet. Bill's face paled. That doesn't prove anything. Maybe not by itself. Roy opened another file. But this might. The second video, taken from a neighbor's security camera, showed Bill adjusting his camera angle and waiting for the flames to grow larger before taking his photos. Even more damaging, it showed him making a phone call to the police before Tyler had even started the fire. "You called in the arrest before the supposed crime occurred," Roy said calmly. "That's conspiracy, Bill. Conspiracy to file false charges against a minor." Bill sank into his chair. "Where did you get these?" "The Hendersons across the street have a Ring doorbell. Amazing how much those things capture." Roy paused the video on a clear shot of Bill's face. "But that's not the best part." He swiped to a new file, an audio recording. Bill's voice came through clearly. "Linda, it's me. He lit the fire. Phase 1 is go. You coordinated with my wife to frame my son," Roy continued, his voice even. "That makes this a conspiracy involving multiple parties. The district attorney is going to love this." Bill's hands shook as he reached for his coffee cup. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something, Bill. When you came after my family, you crossed the line. When you involved my son in your daughter's marital problems, you made an enemy." Roy stood and walked to the wall of awards. 30 years of service, respected community leader, pillar of Pine Ridge society. All of that disappears when this video goes public. "The video doesn't show." "The video shows a fire chief conspiring to frame an innocent teenager for political purposes," Roy cut him off. "It shows abuse of power, corruption, and conspiracy. Your pension, your reputation, your legacy, all gone." Bill's voice was barely audible. "What do you want?" Roy turned back to face him. "I want you to retire immediately. Health reasons, family concerns, whatever story you want to tell, but you're done as fire chief." "I can't just—" "You can, and you will," Roy said, leaning across Bill's desk. "Because if you don't, I'm going to the state attorney general with evidence that Pine Ridge's fire chief has been using his position to settle personal scores. How many other people have you targeted over the years, Bill? How many other crimes have you manufactured?" Roy straightened up. "I'm also going to every person you've ever written up for fire code violations and suggesting they might want to review your findings. Suddenly, your entire career becomes suspect." Bill was trapped, and he knew it. A fire chief caught manufacturing evidence would face federal civil rights charges. His pension would be forfeited, his reputation destroyed, and his family humiliated. "You have until Monday to announce your retirement," Roy continued. "After that, this video goes viral whether you quit or not." As Roy reached the door, Bill called out desperately, "Roy, wait, Linda's my daughter. I was trying to help her." Roy paused, but didn't turn around. "By destroying an innocent kid's future? By abusing your oath of office? By conspiring to commit fraud? I thought if Tyler faced some consequences, you'd realize you needed to be a better father, a better husband." Now Roy did turn around, and Bill recoiled from the cold fury in his eyes. "You thought wrong, Bill. About everything." Roy left the fire station and drove directly to his attorney's office. By evening, he'd filed divorce papers citing adultery and abandonment. He'd also filed a formal complaint against Bill Hendress with the state fire marshal's office. The complaint wouldn't go anywhere. Roy planned to withdraw it once Bill retired, but it would create an official record of allegations. That night, Roy and Tyler grilled steaks on the back deck, using the same fire pit that had started this whole mess. As they ate, Roy explained what he'd learned about building leverage and using it strategically. "The key is never to reveal all your cards at once," Roy said. "I could have destroyed Trevor and Bill immediately, but then Linda might have fought the divorce. By taking them down piece by piece, I control the narrative." Tyler nodded thoughtfully, understanding at last how resilience and careful planning could reclaim dignity and define one's future. What about Trevor? Is he really going to prison? Trevor's license will be suspended pending investigation. His wife is divorcing him and taking half his assets. His reputation in the architecture community is finished. Roy sipped his beer. He'll survive, but he'll never be the successful man your mother thought she was trading up for. Good. Tyler's voice carried a hardness that reminded Roy of himself at that age. What they did to us taught us who they really were, Roy corrected gently. That's valuable information, Tyler. Most people never see their enemies' true faces until it's too late. Over the weekend, Pine Ridge buzzed with gossip about Fire Chief Hendriss's sudden announcement of early retirement due to family health concerns. Nobody questioned the timing, and Bill played his part perfectly, accepting congratulations and well wishes with apparent grace. Linda called twice, both times begging Roy to reconsider the divorce terms. Trevor, it seemed, was in no position to support a new wife. His assets were frozen pending investigation. His business was collapsing and his legal bills were mounting. The successful architect Linda thought she was running away with had become a liability. Roy let both calls go to voicemail. By Sunday night, Tyler seemed more like his old self. The experience had aged him, but it had also strengthened him. He'd learned that the world could be cruel and unfair, but he'd also learned that sometimes the righteous could fight back and win. I start college in 5 weeks, Tyler said as they cleaned up after dinner. I keep thinking about leaving you here alone. I won't be alone, Roy replied. I've got the business, the crew, this house. Besides, you've got your own life to build. What if Mom tries to come back? What if she realizes what she gave up? Roy considered this. Linda was proud and stubborn, but she was also practical. When Trevor's situation became truly desperate, she might indeed try to return. Your mother made her choice, Roy said finally. She chose another man over her family. She chose her father's approval over her son's welfare. Those aren't the kind of choices you get to take back. Tyler nodded, but Roy could see the conflict in his son's eyes. Despite everything, Tyler still loved his mother. That was natural, even healthy, but it was also a potential weakness their enemies could exploit. Roy made a mental note to have one more conversation with Linda before Tyler left for college. Not to reconcile, that ship had sailed, but to make sure she understood that any attempt to manipulate Tyler's emotions would have severe consequences. The game was nearly over, but Roy had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments came when victory seemed assured. Linda, Trevor, and Bill were beaten, but beaten animals could still bite. Roy intended to make sure they understood that biting back wasn't an option. Monday morning brought the Trevor Ashford to Roy's doorstep. The architect, who'd once carried himself with arrogant confidence, now looked haggard, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his face drawn with exhaustion. Roy, we need to talk, Trevor said, his voice shaky. Roy studied him through the screen door. About what? You know what? The investigation, the evidence, Patricia's divorce filing, all of it. Trevor glanced around nervously. Can I come in? Roy opened the door and led Trevor to the living room, noting how the man's hands shook as he sat down. Fear, Roy realized. Trevor was terrified. I know you're behind this, Trevor began without preamble. The timing is too convenient. Linda leaves me and suddenly my whole life falls apart. Linda left you? Roy raised an eyebrow. I thought you two were riding off into the sunset together. Trevor's laugh was bitter. She disappeared the moment the FBI showed up at my office. Apparently, love doesn't survive federal investigations. Roy felt a cold satisfaction, but kept his expression neutral. What do you want from me, Trevor? I want you to call off the dogs. Trevor leaned forward desperately. I know you orchestrated this somehow. The permit fraud investigation, Patricia finding out about us. Even the timing of Linda's departure. It's all too coordinated. You're giving me too much credit, Trevor, Roy replied. I'm just a simple construction worker, remember? According to Linda, I lack the sophistication for complex schemes. Trevor's face flushed. I'll make this right. I'll leave Pine Ridge, never come back. Linda and I are finished anyway. Are you? Roy tilted his head. My sources say Linda's been calling you nonstop since Friday. Trevor's shoulders sagged. She wants me to fight this to clear my name. She doesn't understand. There's nothing to fight. The evidence is real, Roy. I did take those kickbacks. I manipulated those permits. I got greedy and stupid. Yes, you did, Roy said, standing and walking to the window, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood. You also tried to destroy my business to help your criminal friends. You corrupted the permit process that honest contractors depend on, and you participated in a scheme to frame my son. I never framed your son, Trevor protested weakly. Roy turned back. Trevor, you've been delaying permits for my projects while fast-tracking them for Clearwater construction. When Tyler's arrest made headlines, guess who submitted the winning bid for the Morrison project? The same project my company was supposed to get. Trevor's face went white. How did you know about Morrison? Because I make it my business to know when people try to cheat me, Roy said, sitting back down and leaning forward. Here's what's going to happen, Trevor. You're going to leave Pine Ridge today. You're going to stay away from Linda, Tyler, and anyone else connected to my family, and you're going to accept whatever punishment comes from your criminal activities. And if you don't... Roy smiled, but it was cold and predatory. Then I released the recordings. What recordings? Trevor asked, his voice barely a whisper. Roy pulled out his phone and played a brief audio clip. Trevor's voice came through clearly. Roy Brennan thinks he's so smart, but he doesn't know Linda's been feeding me information about his bids for months. The Morrison project is in the bag. I just need to delay his permits until after the deadline. Trevor shot to his feet. That's impossible. I never said that. Didn't you? Roy paused the recording. Linda's been wearing a wire for 3 weeks, Trevor. Amazing what people will do when they realize their boyfriend might go to prison. This was Roy's masterpiece of manipulation. He'd convinced Linda that Trevor was planning to blame her for the permit fraud, that her only hope was to gather evidence of his real activities. She'd recorded dozens of hours of conversations, and Trevor had been appallingly indiscreet. Linda was working with you. Trevor's voice was barely a whisper. Linda was protecting herself, Roy corrected, just like you would have done in her position. Trevor collapsed back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. She played me. She played both of us, Roy said. The difference is I expected it. Roy let Trevor absorb this before continuing. The recordings document your entire criminal enterprise, Trevor. Bribery, fraud, conspiracy, even money laundering through your business accounts. The FBI doesn't just have evidence, they have confessions. You're lying. Roy played another clip. This time, Trevor was explaining to Linda how he'd been hiding bribes through fake consulting contracts. His voice was relaxed, confident, boastful. I counted 47 separate federal crimes in the recordings, Roy said casually. My attorney thinks you're looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. Trevor buried his face in his hands. What do you want? I want you gone today, no contact with Linda, no attempts to return to Pine Ridge, no efforts to salvage your reputation. You disappear quietly and accept whatever comes. And if I do that, then I keep the worst recordings to myself. The ones where you discuss bribing federal inspectors on the post office project. Trevor looked up sharply. There aren't any federal inspectors involved and... He stopped as he realized what he'd almost admitted. Roy had been fishing, and Trevor had just confirmed there were indeed federal crimes beyond what Roy already knew about. "Thank you for that clarification," Roy said pleasantly. "I'll make sure to mention it in my next conversation with Agent Martinez from the FBI." Trevor stood up shakily. "You've destroyed my life." "No," Roy replied. "I've revealed the life you were already living. The bribes, the corruption, the fraud, that was all you, Trevor. I just made sure the right people found out about it." After Trevor left, Roy called his private investigator. He wanted confirmation that Trevor actually left town and wasn't planning any desperate retaliation. Men with nothing left to lose could be dangerous. The investigator called back within hours. Trevor left Pine Ridge westbound on Route 6. He emptied his office and cleaned out his bank accounts. There's no sign he's sticking around, and he was traveling alone. "He's gone, Roy." Roy thanked him, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. A sense of justice and at last of safety settled in the Brennan household as the sun dipped low over Pine Ridge. Trevor Ashford just bought a one-way ticket to Seattle. Leaves tonight. His wife's attorney confirmed he's agreed to an uncontested divorce in exchange for supervised visitation with his kids. Roy felt a grim satisfaction. Trevor was neutralized. His life was in ruins, but he was still breathing. It was more mercy than the man deserved. But Roy wasn't a killer. He was something perhaps even more daunting, a man who destroyed his enemies completely, leaving them alive to suffer the consequences. That evening, Tyler found Roy in his office, reviewing construction plans for upcoming projects. The business was thriving despite Trevor's sabotage. Word was spreading quickly that Roy Brennan was a contractor who finished on time and on budget. "Dad, I heard Trevor left town," Tyler said. "Word travels fast." Roy set down his pencil. "How do you feel about that?" Tyler considered the question seriously. "Relieved, I think, but also, I don't know." "Confused about what?" "About Mom. She chose him over us, but then she betrayed him too. What kind of person does that make her?" Roy leaned back in his chair. "What kind of person do you think it makes her?" "I used to think she was weak," Tyler said slowly. "Like she got swept up in some fantasy about a better life. But betraying Trevor like that takes planning, cold calculation." "Yes, it does." "So, which is the real Mom? The weak woman who got seduced by a smooth-talking architect, or the calculating woman who recorded him for weeks?" Roy considered how much truth his son could handle. Tyler was 18, legally an adult, but still young enough to believe the world should make sense. "Maybe they're both real," Roy said finally. "Maybe your mother is weak when it serves her purposes, and calculating when that serves her purposes. Maybe consistency isn't something she values." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "And you knew she'd betray Trevor?" "I counted on it." Roy met his son's eyes. "Your mother is fundamentally selfish, Tyler. She'll side with whoever offers her the best deal at any given moment. Once Trevor became a liability instead of an asset, she was always going to turn on him." "That's a horrible way to think about your own wife." "Yes, it is." Roy's voice was quiet. "But it's also accurate. And in this situation, accuracy mattered more than sentiment." Tyler was quiet for a long moment. "Will she try to come back now that Trevor's gone?" "Probably." Roy turned back to his construction plans. "But it won't matter. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." As Tyler headed upstairs to pack for college, Roy reflected on the day's victory. Trevor was neutralized, fleeing to Seattle with his tail between his legs. Linda was isolated, her lover gone, and her schemes exposed. Bill Hendress was retiring in disgrace, his reputation tarnished. But Roy wasn't done yet. He'd won this round decisively, but he wanted to make sure his enemies understood the cost of crossing him. More importantly, he wanted to send a message to anyone else who might consider targeting his family. Roy leaned over his desk, making a few last notes on a blueprint, determined that everyone would understand. No one attacked a Brennan and walked away unscathed. The game was entering its final phase, and Roy intended to finish it in a way that would be remembered. Linda returned to Pine Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a rental car and wearing dark sunglasses, as though she were a celebrity trying to avoid paparazzi. Roy watched from his office window as she parked across the street, clearly gathering her courage before approaching the house. She'd called 3 times since Trevor fled to Seattle, but Roy had let each call go to voicemail. Her messages had evolved from angry demands to desperate pleas. Trevor's spectacular fall had left her stranded. Her lover was broke and facing federal charges. Her father was retired in disgrace, and her brothers had made it clear she wasn't welcome in their homes. Roy had expected this moment. Linda was predictable in her selfishness, and with all her other options exhausted, she'd inevitably try to reconcile with the husband she'd betrayed. When the doorbell rang, Roy waited a full minute before answering. Linda stood on his doorstep looking haggard and desperate, a far cry from the confident woman who denounced her affair and demanded a divorce. "Roy, please, we need to talk." "Do we?" Roy made no move to invite her in. "About us? About Tyler? About our family?" Linda's voice cracked. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we can fix this." Roy studied her for a long moment. "What about Trevor?" Linda's face twisted with disgust. "Trevor was a liar and a criminal. I had no idea what he really was. No idea." Roy pulled out his phone and played one of Linda's own recordings. Her voice came through clearly. "Trevor, honey, Roy's bidding on the Riverside project tomorrow. The budget ceiling is $450, but I know he'll go as low as $420 to get the job." Linda's face went white as she recognized her own words. Words that had helped Trevor's criminal associates underbid Roy's legitimate estimates. "You knew exactly what Trevor was," Roy continued. "You helped him steal jobs from me, manipulate permits, and defraud clients. You were his partner, Linda, not his victim. I was trying to survive." Linda's composure cracked. "You don't understand what it's like being married to someone who's never home, who cares more about his business than his wife. So, you decided to destroy that business?" Roy's voice was calm, but Linda recoiled from the ice in his eyes. "You gave our family's financial information to a criminal. You helped him steal contracts that put food on our table. You betrayed 20 years of marriage for what, Linda? Better restaurants? Fancier clothes?" Linda tried to push past him into the house, but Roy blocked her way. "This is my home, too." Was. Roy pulled out the divorce papers Linda had signed. "You forfeited all claims to this property. You also agreed to supervised visitation with Tyler only." "I was under duress when I signed those." "Were you under duress when you had our son arrested? When you stood by and watched him get handcuffed for a crime that never happened?" Linda's lip trembled as she looked for anything to say that would restore the life she'd so carelessly thrown away, but Roy's resolve was unyielding. Linda's face crumpled. "I thought Dad was helping. I thought Tyler needed to learn." "You thought?" Roy's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. "You didn't think, Linda. You plotted. You conspired with your father and your lover to frame an innocent kid because it served your purposes." "Roy, please." Linda was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. I know I hurt you, hurt Tyler, but I can make it right. Trevor's gone. I've learned my lesson and I want to come home. This isn't your home anymore. Roy stepped forward, forcing Linda to back up. Your home is wherever Trevor Ashford is rotting in federal custody. Trevor doesn't matter. I choose you, Roy. I choose our family. Roy laughed, but it was cold and humorless. You don't get to choose anymore, Linda. You made your choice when you betrayed me. You made your choice when you helped him steal from me. You made your choice when you had our son arrested. Linda flinched at the blunt truth, but Roy wasn't finished. You burned this family to the ground for an upgrade that turned out to be a fraud. Now you want to come back because you're scared and broke and alone. That's not how this works. I'll do anything, Linda whispered. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. Just please don't throw away 20 years. I didn't throw away 20 years, Roy replied. You did when you chose Trevor over Tyler. When you chose your father's approval over your husband's trust. When you chose to be a criminal's accomplice over an honest man's wife. Roy reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. These are copies of all your recordings of Trevor. 47 hours of conversations documenting federal crimes. The FBI has the originals, but I thought you might like copies for your scrapbook. Linda stared at the envelope in horror. You can't seriously believe I was working with you against Trevor. That was just what? Roy interrupted. Just you playing all sides against each other. Just you hedging your bets in case Trevor went down. Linda's silence was answer enough. The beautiful thing about your recordings, Roy continued, is that they document your knowledge of Trevor's crimes, which makes you an accessory after the fact. The FBI is very interested in talking to you, Linda. I was helping you gather evidence. Were you? Because that's not what Agent Martinez thinks. He thinks you were Trevor's accomplice who tried to flip when the heat got too intense. Roy pulled out his phone and showed Linda a text message from an unknown number. Mrs. Brennan, this is Agent Martinez with the FBI. Please contact our office to schedule an interview regarding your knowledge of Trevor Ashford's criminal activities. Linda read the message twice, her face growing paler. This is a mistake. I was helping you stop Trevor. Then you'll have no trouble explaining that to federal investigators, Roy said, putting his phone away. I'm sure they'll be very understanding about your motives. Linda grabbed Roy's arm desperately, tears streaking her cheeks. You have to help me. Tell them I was working with you. Tell them I was gathering evidence for you. Roy looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. Why would I do that? Because I'm Tyler's mother. Because we were married for 20 years. Because, despite everything, you still love me. Roy gently removed Linda's hand from his arm. I did love you, Linda. Past tense. The woman I loved would never have betrayed her son. The woman I loved had integrity, loyalty, honor. That woman has been gone for months. I'm just now admitting it. Linda backed away from him, finally understanding that her tears and pleas were useless. What happens now? Now you face the consequences of your choices. Roy stepped back into the house. Tyler starts a college next week. He'll have supervised visitation rights if he chooses to exercise them, but I suspect he won't. The FBI will want to interview you about Trevor's crimes, and you'll live with the knowledge that you destroyed your own family for nothing. Roy, wait. But Roy had already closed the door. Through the frosted glass, he could see Linda's silhouette standing on his porch for several minutes before finally walking away. From upstairs, Tyler called down, "Was that Mom?" Yes. Roy locked the door and set the security system. She wanted to come home. Tyler appeared at the top of the stairs. What did you tell her? I told her the truth. That home is for family and she chose not to be part of ours. Tyler nodded slowly. Do you think she'll try again? Roy considered this. Linda was desperate, but she was also practical. The FBI interview would occupy her attention for the next several weeks, and after that, she'd likely be too focused on staying out of prison to worry about reconciliation. I think she'll be busy with other problems, Roy said. But even if she does try again, the answer will be the same. That evening, Roy cooked steaks for him and Tyler using the grill on their back deck. It was peaceful, comfortable, just father and son preparing for the next chapter of their lives. I leave for college Sunday, Tyler said as they ate. I know. Roy cut his steak carefully. You ready? I think so. Dad, what you did to Trevor and Mom and Grandpa Bill, it was brilliant, but it was also brutal. Roy set down his fork. It was necessary. I know. I'm not criticizing you. I want to understand. How do you live with being that calculating, that ruthless? Roy considered the question seriously. By remembering what they did to us first, Tyler. They came after our family, our business, our reputation. They tried to destroy an innocent kid's future to serve their own selfish purposes. I didn't start this war. I just finished it. Tyler nodded thoughtfully. And you don't feel guilty about what happened to them? I feel guilty about one thing, Roy admitted. I feel guilty that I didn't see what they really were sooner, that I let them get close enough to hurt us in the first place. Tyler seemed to understand as the sun set behind the mountains, and a quiet sense of closure began to settle over their home. As they cleaned up after dinner, Tyler asked one final question. Do you think I'll ever be able to trust people again? Really trust them? Roy paused, loading the dishwasher. I think you'll learn to trust the right people, Tyler. The people who prove themselves through actions, not words. The people who stand by you when things get difficult, not just when it's convenient. Like you did, like we did. Roy met his son's eyes. We stood by each other, Tyler. That's what family does. Sunday morning came too quickly. Roy helped Tyler load his truck with everything he'd need for his freshman year at Colorado State. As they worked, neighbors stopped by to wish Tyler well. The entire street had rallied around the Brennan family after the arrest scandal, and several had offered to testify about Bill Hendriss's suspicious behavior if needed. As Tyler prepared to drive away, he hugged his father tightly. Thank you, Dad, for everything, for protecting me, for standing up to them, for showing me what real strength looks like. Roy felt unexpected emotion well up in his chest. You make me proud every day, son. Go build something great. As Tyler's truck disappeared down the mountain road, Roy stood in his driveway, surveying his domain. The house, the business, the reputation. He had protected it all and emerged stronger than before. His enemies were scattered and defeated. Trevor faced federal prison. Linda faced federal investigation and social exile. Bill faced retirement and disgrace. But Roy Brennan stood tall, his integrity intact, and his family honor restored. The war was over, and he had won completely. 3 weeks into Tyler's freshman year, Roy received an unexpected visitor. Patricia Ashford arrived at his construction office on a Thursday afternoon, looking nervous but determined. Trevor's ex-wife was an attractive woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes that had seen too much recently. Mr. Brennan, I'm Patricia Ashford. I wondered if we could talk. Roy invited her into his private office, curious about what had brought her to Pine Ridge. According to his private investigator, Patricia had been living quietly in Denver, focused on raising her 2 daughters and rebuilding her life after Trevor's spectacular downfall. I wanted to thank you, Patricia began once they were seated, "for giving me the evidence I needed to protect my children from Trevor's criminal activities." Roy studied her carefully. "I'm not sure what you mean." Patricia smiled sadly. "Please, don't pretend, Mr. Brennan. I know you orchestrated Trevor's downfall. The timing, the evidence, the way everything came together. It was too perfect to be coincidence. Trevor orchestrated his own downfall by breaking the law. Yes, he did, but you made sure the right people found out about it." Patricia leaned forward. "I want you to know that what you did saved my daughter's futures." Roy listened silently, realizing in that moment that sometimes justice meant more than just protecting your own family. It meant setting things right for others as well. Trevor was talking about involving them in his business, using our family name to legitimize his corruption. Your actions stopped that. Roy felt uncomfortable with her gratitude. He had destroyed Trevor for personal reasons, not altruistic ones. "Patricia, I didn't do anything to help you. I was protecting my own family." "I know, but the result was the same." She opened her purse and pulled out a manila folder. "That's why I wanted to warn you about this." Roy opened the folder and found a private investigator's report with his name on the cover. Inside were photographs of him meeting with various people over the past month, copies of his financial records, and detailed surveillance notes about his daily routine. "Where did you get this?" Roy asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Linda hired a private investigator to build a case against you. She's claiming you framed Trevor, manipulated evidence, and coerced her into providing false testimony against him." Roy flipped through the report, noting the investigator's conclusions. "This is all speculation and circumstantial evidence." "I know, but Linda's not planning to take it to the police." Patricia's voice grew serious. "She's planning to take it to Trevor." Roy looked up sharply. "Trevor's in federal custody." "Trevor posted bail last week. He's out pending trial, living in Seattle under strict supervision, but Linda's been in contact with him, and she's convinced him that you're responsible for everything that happened." Roy felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. "She's trying to get him to come after me. More than that, she's trying to get him to come after Tyler. She's filled Trevor's head with ideas about getting revenge on your son the way you supposedly got revenge on them." Roy closed the folder carefully, his mind already racing through possibilities. Trevor, facing 20 years in federal prison, would be desperate enough to try anything. Linda, facing her own federal investigation, would have every reason to redirect attention toward Roy. "How do you know all this?" Roy asked. Patricia looked uncomfortable. "Trevor's been calling me, trying to get me to recant my testimony against him. During those calls, he's mentioned Linda's theories about you. He's also mentioned plans to even the score before his trial." "Plans?" "He knows Tyler's at Colorado State. He knows Tyler's schedule, his dorm room, his class locations. Linda provided him with everything." Roy felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Patricia, why are you telling me this? If Trevor's convicted, it helps your divorce case." "Because I don't want anyone else to get hurt." Patricia's voice was firm. "Trevor made his choices, and he deserves whatever punishment he gets. But Tyler's just a kid who got caught in the middle of adult problems." Roy stood and walked to his office window, looking out at the construction site where his crew was framing a new house. Honest work, honest men, building something that would last. He drew in a steady breath, making a silent promise to himself that no matter how desperate his enemies became, he would do whatever was necessary to protect his son. The kind of life he tried to provide for his family. When did Linda contact Trevor? According to the call logs I obtained through my attorney, They've been talking daily since he made bail. She's also been sending him money. Roy turned back to Patricia. Money she doesn't have. She's been selling things, jewelry, furniture, even her car. She's desperate, Mr. Brennan, and desperate people do dangerous things. Roy studied Patricia's face, searching for deception or hidden motives, but she seemed genuinely concerned. A mother protecting not just her own children, but someone else's as well. "What do you want from me?" Roy asked. "I want you to protect Tyler, and I want you to stop Linda before she pushes Trevor into doing something that will destroy more lives." Roy sat back down, his mind working through the implications. Linda and Trevor together were dangerous. They had nothing left to lose and a shared enemy to blame for their problems. Worse, they had detailed information about Tyler's location and schedule. "Patricia, I need to ask you something and I need an honest answer. Is Trevor capable of violence?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "The Trevor I married wouldn't hurt a fly, but the Trevor I divorced had become someone I didn't recognize. Desperate, angry, paranoid. So, yes, I think he's capable of almost anything right now." Roy nodded grimly. "Then I need to make some phone calls." His first call was to Tyler, warning him to be extra careful and to report any suspicious activity around campus. His second call was to a private security firm in Fort Collins, arranging discreet protection for his son. His third call was to his attorney, discussing options for a restraining order against both Linda and Trevor. But even as he made these defensive preparations, Roy was planning something more proactive. Linda and Trevor had crossed a line by threatening Tyler. They had moved from defeated enemies to active threats, and Roy Brennan had never tolerated threats to his family. "Patricia," Roy said after finishing his calls, "I need to ask a favor." "What kind of favor?" "The kind that might be legally questionable, but morally justified." Roy met her eyes steadily. "Are you willing to help me protect both our children from your ex-husband and my ex-wife?" Patricia considered this for a long moment. "What did you have in mind?" Roy opened his desk drawer and pulled out a digital recorder. "Linda and Trevor think they're setting a trap for me. I think it's time to show them what a real trap looks like." As Patricia listened to Roy's plan, her expression shifted from concern to surprise, then to grim satisfaction. By the time he finished explaining, she was nodding slowly. "You're right," she said. "It is legally questionable." But then she squared her shoulders. "But Linda and Trevor forfeited their right to legal protection when they decided to target innocent children." Patricia stood up, her jaw set with determination. "What do you need me to do?" Roy handed her a slip of paper with careful instructions written in his precise lettering, outlining the first step in turning the tables on their would-be aggressors. Together, they were ready to face the dangers ahead, whatever it took to keep their children safe. Roy smiled, but it was the cold, predatory expression his enemies had learned to fear. "I need you to make a phone call to your ex-husband. Tell him you want to meet with him about possibly changing your testimony, and then we remind Linda and Trevor that some people fight back harder when cornered." As Patricia left to make the call that would lure Trevor back to Colorado, Roy reflected on how the game had changed. He'd thought his enemies were defeated, but they'd regrouped for one final assault on his family. It would be their last mistake. Roy Brennan had shown mercy once, allowing his enemies to retreat with their lives, but they had interpreted mercy as weakness and returned for more blood. This time, there would be no mercy. This time, he would finish them completely. Trevor arrived in Pine Ridge on a cold October morning, driving a rented sedan and wearing the desperate expression of a man with nothing left to lose. Roy watched from his office as Trevor checked into the Mountain View Motel, the same place he'd used for his affair with Linda months earlier. Patricia had played her part perfectly, convincing Trevor that she was having second thoughts about her testimony. The promise of a recanted statement had been too tempting for Trevor to resist, especially with federal sentencing looming in 6 weeks. Roy's phone buzzed with a text from his security team. Subject has arrived, no sign of the female, proceeding as planned. Linda hadn't accompanied Trevor, which meant she was likely coordinating from a distance. Roy suspected she was staying safely away from the confrontation she'd helped orchestrate, leaving Trevor to handle the dangerous work while she maintained plausible deniability. It was a cowardly strategy, and it confirmed everything Roy had learned about his ex-wife's character. At 2 p.m., Patricia called Trevor from the parking lot of a coffee shop downtown. Roy listened in on a speakerphone as she delivered her scripted lines perfectly. "Trevor, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about our marriage, about the girls, about your trial. Patricia, thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this is difficult." "It is difficult, but I keep thinking about what Mr. Brennan said to me when he gave me those recordings." Roy heard Trevor's intake of breath. "What did he say?" "He said that sometimes innocent people get caught in other people's wars, that you were just a pawn in his fight with Linda." This was the hook. The suggestion that Roy had manipulated Trevor rather than simply exposing his crimes. For a desperate man looking for someone else to blame, it was irresistible. "He said that." Trevor's voice was eager. "Patricia, I've been trying to tell you. Brennan orchestrated everything. The investigation, the evidence, even Linda's betrayal. He destroyed our family to protect his own reputation." "I'm starting to believe that," Patricia said sadly. "I think he's been playing all of us, Trevor. I think he's been playing you, me, and Linda. He's been playing us all." Roy could hear the desperation in Trevor's voice. "What do you want to do about it?" "I want to help you, Trevor. I want to help you clear your name and protect our girls. But I need to know that you're willing to fight back. Are you willing to do whatever it takes to expose Brennan for what he really is?" There was a long pause before Trevor responded. "Yes, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Roy nodded, satisfied. The trap was set. Now, all that remained was to spring it. Roy could practically hear Linda's mind racing. The offer was too good to be true, which meant she'd immediately suspect a trap. But desperation would overcome suspicion. It always did. "Why would you offer this?" Linda asked. "Because I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. Because Tyler deserves to start his life without this hanging over him. Because I want you and Trevor gone permanently. And this is the price I'm willing to pay." "Where would this meeting happen?" "Tonight, 8 p.m., the old mining office up on Prospect Ridge. Come alone and bring Trevor. I'll have the evidence with me." Roy hung up before Linda could ask more questions. Within minutes, his phone rang again. Patricia was calling from her meeting with Trevor. "He bought it," Patricia reported. "I convinced him that I was having doubts about my testimony. He's desperate enough to believe anyone who offers him hope." "Good. Did he mention Linda?" "He said she'd been right about you all along, that you were the real villain in this whole situation." Roy felt cold satisfaction. Trevor and Linda had created their own version of events where they were victims rather than perpetrators. It was a delusion that would make them easier to manipulate. "Patricia, I need you to do one more thing. Call Trevor back in an hour and tell him you've changed your mind, that you're scared of what Roy might do if you recant your testimony. And then you disappear. Go to your sister's house in Grand Junction like we discussed. Stay there until this is over." As the sun set over Pine Ridge, Roy made his final preparations. He loaded his truck with supplies, checked his weapons, and reviewed the surveillance equipment that would ensure he had every angle covered. His security team was in place, ready to move at his command. Everything was set for the final confrontation. At 7:30 p.m., Roy drove up to the old mining office, parking his truck out of sight and approaching the building on foot. The night was cold and clear, the perfect cover for his plans. He positioned himself inside, hidden in the shadows, and waited. At 7:55 p.m., he received a text from his security team. Subjects approaching, ETA 5 minutes. Roy took a deep breath, steadying himself for the confrontation. This was it, the final gambit. Trevor and Linda were walking into a trap of their own making, and he was ready to finish this once and for all. The abandoned mining office on Prospect Ridge was perfect for his purposes. Isolated with only one access road and riddled with the kind of structural hazards that made accidents believable. Roy arrived first, parking his truck behind the building and checking his equipment one final time. Hidden cameras, digital recorders, and a satellite phone for emergency communication. Everything was ready. At exactly 8 p.m., he heard car engines approaching. Through the grimy windows, he watched two vehicles navigate the rough mountain road. Trevor's rental sedan, followed by Linda's borrowed SUV. Roy stepped outside to meet them, his hands visible and empty. "Trevor," Roy called out. "Linda says you have evidence that can clear me." "I do." Roy held up a manila envelope. Financial records proving that Patricia falsified bank statements. Audio recordings where she admits to lying about our conversations. Even video evidence showing her doctoring documents. Trevor's eyes fixed on the envelope hungrily. "Why would you help me?" "Because I'm tired of this war. Because I want you both gone from my life permanently." Roy looked directly at Linda through her windshield. "This evidence clears you, Trevor, but it also implicates Patricia in federal crimes. Insurance against future problems." Trevor stepped closer, his desperation overriding his caution. "Let me see it." Roy tossed the envelope to Trevor, who caught it eagerly and began examining the contents. As Trevor read, his expression shifted from hope to confusion to growing anger. "This is all fake." "Yes, it is." Roy's voice was calm. "Just like the original evidence against you is real. You committed those crimes, Trevor. You took those bribes, manipulated those permits, defrauded those clients. Patricia didn't lie about anything. She just made sure the right people learned the truth." Understanding dawned in Trevor's eyes. "This is a trap." "This is justice," Roy corrected. "You and Linda came here planning to threaten my son to force me into helping you escape the consequences of your crimes. Instead, you're going to face those consequences." Linda gunned her engine, clearly planning to flee, but Roy wasn't concerned. His security team had disabled her vehicle during the meeting. She wasn't going anywhere. Trevor lunged toward Roy, but he was soft from months of stress and legal battles. Roy, hardened by 30 years of construction work, easily sidestepped the attack and sent Trevor sprawling on the rocky ground. "It's over, Trevor," Roy said as Trevor struggled to get up. "The FBI has recordings of you threatening Tyler. They have evidence of you and Linda planning to intimidate witnesses. They have everything they need to add conspiracy and witness tampering to your federal charges." Roy pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "It's time. Bring them in." Within minutes, FBI agents swarmed the area, surrounding Trevor and Linda. Agent Martinez stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. "Trevor Ashford, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit witness tampering and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Trevor looked up at Roy, his face a mask of betrayal and rage. "You're a monster, Roy. You're going to pay for this." Roy smiled coldly. No, Trevor. You're the one who's going to pay for everything. As the FBI agents led Trevor and Linda away, Roy watched with a sense of finality. The war was over, and he had won. His family was safe, and his enemies were defeated. He had protected what was his, and he had done it without mercy. Trevor's face was bleeding from his fall, but his eyes blazed with desperate fury. You can't prove anything. Roy held up his phone, showing the recording app that had been running throughout their conversation. Actually, I can prove everything, including your confession that you're guilty of the original charges. Linda finally emerged from her vehicle, realizing escape was impossible. Roy, please, we'll leave. We'll never bother you again. Just delete those recordings. Like you deleted your plans to hurt Tyler? Roy's voice was ice cold. Like you deleted your conspiracy with your father to frame an innocent kid. That was different. That was the beginning of this. That was different. Roy cut her off. You started a war with my family, Linda. I'm ending it. Roy pressed a button on his phone, sending the recorded conversation to multiple recipients: the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and Tyler's campus security. Within minutes, law enforcement would have everything they needed to put Trevor away for decades and charge Linda as his accomplice. You destroyed us, Linda whispered. No, Roy replied. You destroyed yourselves. I just made sure everyone could see what you really were. As sirens wailed in the distance, Roy's security team had called in law enforcement once Trevor attacked him. Roy looked at his defeated enemies one final time. Trevor would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, his career and reputation destroyed forever. Linda would face conspiracy charges that would likely result in a decade behind bars. Her dreams of a better life turned into a nightmare of orange jumpsuits and prison cells. They'd gambled everything on one final attack against Roy's family, and they'd lost completely. As federal agents cuffed Trevor and Linda, Roy walked back to his truck, already planning his drive home. Tyler was safe, the business was thriving, and his enemies were finally neutralized. The war was over, and Roy Brennan had won decisively. 6 months later, Roy stood in the federal courthouse in Denver, watching as Trevor Ashford was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The man who'd once carried himself with arrogant confidence now looked broken, aged a decade by 6 months of legal proceedings and the reality of his situation. Linda had already been sentenced to 8 years for conspiracy, witness tampering, and accessory charges. She tried to claim coercion and manipulation, but the recordings from Prospect Ridge had made her culpability undeniable. Her final words to Roy as she was led away in shackles had been a curse, promising revenge from prison. Roy had simply smiled and wished her luck with that. Tyler sat beside him in the courtroom gallery, taking a brief break from his successful freshman year to witness the end of a nightmare that had nearly destroyed their family. The young man who'd gone to college was different from the boy who'd been arrested in their driveway. Harder, wearier, but also stronger. Are you satisfied? Tyler asked quietly as Trevor was led away. Roy considered the question seriously. I'm satisfied that justice was done. I'm satisfied that you're safe. I'm satisfied that they can never hurt our family again. But I take no joy in seeing lives destroyed, even lives that deserve destruction. Roy stood as the courtroom began to empty. They chose their path, Tyler. I just made sure they walked it to the end. As they left the courthouse, Tyler asked the question Roy had been expecting. What about Grandpa Bill? Bill Hendress had managed to avoid criminal charges for the false arrest, largely because Roy had decided not to pursue them. The former fire chief had suffered enough. Forced retirement, public humiliation, and the knowledge that his own actions had contributed to his daughter's downfall. "Your grandfather is a broken man living with broken dreams," Roy said. "Prison wouldn't make him more broken, just more bitter." They drove back to Pine Ridge in comfortable silence, the Colorado mountains rising around them like protective barriers. The town looked the same, but Roy knew he was seeing it with different eyes. This was his domain now, the place where he'd proven that honor and determination could triumph over corruption and betrayal. The Brennan Construction Company had flourished during the legal proceedings. Word had spread that Roy was a man who stood by his principles and protected his family, and clients responded accordingly. The company now employed 15 men and had contracts booked 6 months out. More importantly, Roy's reputation in Pine Ridge was unassailable. He was seen as a man who'd been wronged by corrupt officials and family betrayers, but had fought back through legal channels and won decisively. Neighbors who'd watched Tyler get arrested now spoke of Roy with respect and admiration. That evening, Roy cooked dinner for himself and reflected on the past year. He'd started as a successful contractor with a stable family, seemingly blessed with everything a man could want. But that stability had been built on illusions. A wife who was fundamentally disloyal, a father-in-law who was corrupt, and relationships that couldn't survive the first real test of character. Now he was alone in many ways. But he was also free. Free from people who would betray him for personal advantage. Free from relationships built on lies and convenience. Free to rebuild his life on a foundation of truth and earned loyalty. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Tyler's number. "Dad, I just wanted to say thank you for everything you did, for protecting me, for showing me what real strength looks like." Roy felt unexpected emotion well up in his chest. "You don't need to thank me, son. That's what fathers do." "Not all fathers," Tyler said quietly. "I've met guys at college whose dads walked away when things got difficult. Guys whose families fell apart and nobody fought to save them." Roy heard the weight in his son's words and realized that despite everything they'd lost, they had also found something far more important: unbreakable trust and a shared future built on loyalty and hard-won truth. "You could have just accepted what happened, tried to keep the peace, let them win. I couldn't let them hurt you." "I know, and I'll never forget that." Tyler paused. "Dad, I want you to know when I have kids someday, when I build my own family, I'm going to remember what you taught me. That family loyalty isn't just about good times. That real men protect the people they love no matter the cost." After the call ended, Roy sat on his back deck, looking out at the fire pit where this whole nightmare had started. The stones were still perfectly arranged, the safety measures still in place, the area still maintained according to every fire regulation in the book. Bill Hendress had known the fire was completely legal when he had Tyler arrested. He'd manufactured evidence, corrupted the legal process, and traumatized an innocent young man, all to help his daughter's extramarital affairs succeed. Trevor Ashford had known his business practices were criminal when he'd recruited Linda to help steal contracts and manipulate permits. He'd corrupted the bidding process, defrauded clients, and tried to destroy honest competitors, all to feed his greed and impress his mistress. Linda had known exactly what she was doing when she betrayed her husband's business information to her lover and supported her father's false arrest of their son. She'd chosen immediate gratification over family loyalty and temporary excitement over 20 years of marriage. They'd all made their choices freely, with full knowledge of right and wrong. Roy had simply ensured they faced the consequences of those choices. As the sun set over Pine Ridge, Roy felt a deep sense of completion. The war was over. His enemies were defeated, and his family honor was restored. Tyler was thriving at college. The business was stronger than ever, and Roy's reputation was unassailable. But most importantly, Roy had proven to himself that he was the kind of man who would fight for what mattered. When his family was threatened, he'd fought back with intelligence, determination, and ruthless efficiency. When corrupt officials tried to abuse their power, he'd exposed them and seen them face consequences. When criminals tried to destroy his business, he'd gathered evidence and watched them go to prison. He'd shown mercy where mercy was warranted. Bill Hendress faced humiliation rather than incarceration. He'd shown justice where justice was required. Trevor and Linda faced decades in prison for their crimes. Most importantly, he'd shown his son what it meant to be a man who stood by his principles and protected his family. Roy Brennan had entered this war as a trusting husband and father. He was ending it as something harder and colder. A man who understood that some people only respected strength, and that sometimes the righteous had to be willing to fight as fiercely and cleverly as their enemies. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen. And as darkness fell on Pine Ridge, Roy knew that, whatever came next, he was ready to face it, unbreakable and unafraid, with his name and his family's honor intact. And as he looked out over his domain, his house, his business, his town, Roy felt a grim satisfaction. His enemies were gone, his son was safe, and the Brennan name meant something again. He'd won completely, and he could sleep well knowing his family was protected. 2 years after Trevor's sentencing, Roy Brennan stood in his office looking at the latest expansion plans for his company. Brennan Construction now employed 23 people and had just been awarded the contract to build Pine Ridge's new municipal center. A delicious irony, considering Bill Hendress had once used his position to try destroying Roy's family. Tyler was home for Thanksgiving break, now a junior studying civil engineering with plans to join the family business after graduation. The young man who walked through the door bore little resemblance to the confused teenager who'd been arrested in their driveway. Tyler had grown tall and confident, with the bearing of someone who'd learned early that the world could be cruel, but that strength and integrity could triumph over corruption. "Dad, you've got visitors," Tyler announced, his tone carefully neutral. Roy looked up to see 2 people he'd hoped never to encounter again. Linda's brothers, Greg and Dale Morrison. Both men looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact. "Roy," Greg began awkwardly, "we wanted to talk to you about Linda." Roy set down his plans and studied the 2 men who'd once supported their father's false arrest of Tyler. "What about her?" "She's up for parole next month," Dale said. She's been asking us to reach out to you." "Has she?" Roy's voice was pleasant, conversational. "About what?" Greg cleared his throat. "She wants to see Tyler, to apologize, to try to make things right." Roy glanced at Tyler, who was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. His son's expression was cold, distant, the look of a young man who'd learned not to trust easily. "Tyler's an adult," Roy said calmly. "He can make his own decisions about who he wants to see." "She's still his mother," Dale pressed, "despite everything that happened." "Is she?" Tyler spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge that reminded Roy of himself. "Because mothers protect their children, don't they? They don't help frame them for crimes they didn't commit." Greg and Dale exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Tyler, your mother made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Tyler stepped into the room, his presence suddenly dominating the space. "My mother helped her lover steal contracts from my father's business. She supported her father's decision to have me arrested on false charges. She conspired to frame an innocent teenager, me, to advance her extramarital affair." Tyler moved closer to his uncles, and Roy noticed how both men instinctively stepped back. "Those weren't mistakes," Tyler said with quiet finality. "Those were choices. Bad choices made by a selfish woman who cared more about her own pleasure than her family's welfare." Greg and Dale looked chastened, unable to meet Tyler's eyes as the truth of his words hung heavily in the room. "Tyler," Greg began, "I'm not finished." Tyler's voice cut through the interruption like a blade. "My mother destroyed our family for 8 months of adultery with a criminal. She watched me get handcuffed and taken to jail, and her only concern was whether her boyfriend would approve. She chose him over me, over Dad, over everything we'd built together." Roy felt a surge of pride watching his son stand his ground. This was what he'd hoped to teach Tyler: that some betrayals were unforgivable, that some relationships couldn't be rebuilt, that sometimes the only healthy choice was to walk away completely. "She's been in prison for almost 3 years, Dale said desperately. "She's changed, learned from her mistakes. She just wants a chance to make things right." Tyler looked at Roy, a silent communication passing between father and son. Then Tyler turned back to his uncles with a smile that was pure Roy Brennan. Cold, predatory, final. "Uncle Greg, Uncle Dale, let me explain something to you. I don't have a mother anymore. I have a biological contributor who chose to be my enemy. The woman who raised me died the night she watched me get arrested for crimes I didn't commit." Tyler paused, letting his words sink in. "If Linda Morrison wants to make things right, she can start by accepting that she destroyed her relationship with me permanently. There's no apology big enough, no gesture dramatic enough, no amount of time long enough to undo what she did." "That's not fair," Greg protested. "Fair?" Tyler's laugh was harsh. "Was it fair when she had me arrested? Was it fair when she helped steal Dad's contracts? Was it fair when she chose a criminal over her family?" Roy decided to intervene before the conversation became completely hostile. "Greg, Dale, you've delivered Linda's message. Tyler has given you his answer. I think it's time for you to leave." "Roy, please." Greg turned to him desperately. "She's family. Despite everything, she's still family." Roy stood slowly, his presence filling the room. "No, she's not. Family doesn't betray family. Family doesn't choose strangers over blood. Family doesn't stand by while innocent children get destroyed for personal gain." Roy walked around his desk, moving closer to the Morrison brothers. "Linda chose to be my enemy and Tyler's enemy. She forfeited any claim to family consideration when she made that choice." "You can't just write off 20 years of marriage," Greg protested. "I didn't write off 20 years of marriage," Roy interrupted. "Linda did when she spread her legs for Trevor Ashford, when she gave him information to steal my contracts, when she supported her father's decision to arrest my son." The room fell silent except for the sound of Dale's heavy breathing. Both Morrison brothers looked defeated, finally understanding that they were fighting a battle that had been lost years ago. "What should we tell Linda?" Greg asked quietly. Tyler answered before Roy could speak. "Tell her that Tyler Brennan died the night she had him arrested. Tell her that the boy she betrayed is gone, and in his place stands a man who will never forgive her. Tell her that she made her choices, and now she has to live with them. Tell her that she's alone, just like she chose to be. Tell her that the man who survived learned important lessons about loyalty, family, and the consequences of betrayal. Tell her that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt." After the Morrison brothers left, Roy and Tyler stood in comfortable silence, looking out at the construction site where Roy's crew was building another family's dream home. "Do you think I was too harsh?" Tyler asked. Roy considered the question carefully. "Do you?" "No. Tyler's voice was firm. She made her choice. She chose Trevor over us, chose her father's approval over my welfare, chose immediate gratification over family loyalty. Those choices have consequences. Yes, they do. Roy put his hand on his son's shoulder. Tyler, I want you to understand something. Being hard isn't the same as being cruel. Setting boundaries isn't the same as being unforgiving. Sometimes protecting yourself and the people you love requires cutting off toxic relationships completely. Tyler nodded. I learned that from watching you, Dad. You didn't just survive what they did to us. You made sure they couldn't do it to anyone else. You made sure there were consequences for their actions. Roy felt a deep satisfaction hearing those words. He'd raised a son who understood that strength sometimes meant saying no, that love sometimes required tough choices, that integrity sometimes demanded sacrifice. What about Linda's parole? Tyler asked. Will she try to contact us directly? Probably. Roy had already anticipated this possibility. But I've taken precautions. Restraining orders, security measures, legal notifications. If she comes within 100 yards of either of us, she goes back to prison immediately. Good. Tyler's approval was evident. Because I meant what I told my uncles. The woman who raised me is dead. Linda Morrison is just a stranger who happens to share my DNA. That evening, Roy cooked Thanksgiving dinner for himself and Tyler, just the two of them. But it felt complete in a way their old family dinners never had. The betrayers were gone, the weak links eliminated, and what remained was strong and genuine. Dad, Tyler said as they cleaned up after dinner, I want you to know that what you did, the way you handled everything, made me proud to be your son. Roy felt emotion well up unexpectedly. Tyler, I mean it. You could have just accepted what happened, tried to keep the peace, let them get away with destroying our family. Instead, you fought back. You made sure there were consequences. You protected me when nobody else would. Tyler paused, choosing his words carefully. I've learned that there are two kinds of men in this world, Dad. The kind who stand by and let bad things happen to good people, and the kind who fight back when they or their families are threatened. You taught me which kind I want to be. Roy nodded, understanding the depth of what his son was saying. And what kind is that? The kind who never forgets a betrayal, Tyler said firmly. The kind who protects his family no matter the cost. The kind who makes sure that harmful actions have consequences. Tyler met Roy's eyes directly. The kind who doesn't forgive people who try to destroy innocent children. Roy felt a fierce pride surge through his chest. He'd raised a son who understood that some lines couldn't be crossed, some betrayals couldn't be forgiven, some relationships couldn't be salvaged. More importantly, he'd raised a son who would protect his own family with the same determined strength Roy had shown in protecting Tyler. As they finished cleaning up, Roy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He'd started as a trusting husband and father, believing that family loyalty and honest work were enough to protect the people he loved. He'd learned that some people viewed loyalty as weakness and honesty as opportunity. He'd seen firsthand that corruption thrived when good people did nothing. He'd realized that sometimes the righteous had to be willing to fight as hard and as fiercely as their enemies. Most importantly, he'd learned that protecting his family was worth any price, any sacrifice, any moral compromise. Linda was getting out of prison next month, but she was returning to a world where Roy Brennan had won completely. Her son wanted nothing to do with her. Her ex-husband was untouchable. Her former lover was serving 18 years in federal prison. Her father was a broken man living in disgrace. She'd gambled everything on betrayal and corruption, and she'd lost everything that mattered. Roy Brennan, meanwhile, stood stronger than ever. His business was thriving, his son was succeeding, his reputation was unassailable, and his enemies were scattered and defeated. He'd proven that honor could triumph over corruption, that loyalty could overcome betrayal, that the righteous could fight back and win. Most importantly, he'd proven to himself and his son that some men were worth crossing, and some families were worth protecting. Roy Brennan had entered this war as a trusting man who believed in the goodness of people. He was ending it as something harder and more dangerous, a man who understood that evil existed, that betrayal was real, and that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to ensure the guilty faced justice fully and finally. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen. And as he looked at his son, strong, confident, unbroken by the betrayals that had nearly destroyed him, Roy knew he'd made the right choices. The war was over, and Roy Brennan had won. The man who remained was someone his enemies would never dare to cross again. The end.